Dante says that Fortune is a god and talks about her
Yeah.
as a god. And this is something that for people interested, obviously, in universal history and also kind of the re-mythologization of Christianity, we've been talking about in some ways the principalities that God created to run over the world. There's a manner in which, even in the Old Testament, the word used for them is interchangeable. Like the idea that they're gods, they're angels, they're stars. All of this stuff is interchangeable in the Old Testament. And it would be easy to accuse Dante of a kind of paganism, and we'll see examples of that now in these cantos that we're going to look at. But it's rather better to understand it in the context of this different vision of Christianity, a kind of idea that the gods do exist, like all the gods exist, and that it's not true that there's one God and that there's all of us. That there's a myriad of intermediaries that are in between God and us, that act on us, that contrive our action, that influence us. All of these things are true and do not take away from the idea that we do believe and worship and follow the one true God that is uncreated. And so that's really important to understand as we move forward. But it's also nice to notice in Dante the moments where he plays with us a little and is willing to call a servant of God, Fortune, say that she's a god.
Yeah. And people in the Middle Ages were pretty comfortable with this kind of language.
Yeah.
It's funny. So I've been recently revisiting a bunch of reading on the 15th and 16th century, and not just the Protestant Reformation, but actually all the different reformations that are happening within the Protestant world, also within Catholicism, right, all around that time. And this is just for because I like to read history, and so I've been rereading a bunch of stuff from Erasmus, and Erasmus, who notably didn't join the Reformation, but was certainly kind of a precursor to it. He's really irritated by all this language. Like, he just really hates it. And it's a kind of a funny thing, because Erasmus is part of the humanist movement, which is all about going back to the sources, ad fontes. And it's all about going back to the sources of Western culture. So it's like, we got to skip over this Christian stuff and go back to the pagan stuff, go back to that. So they're trying to go back to that, but then they're complaining that medieval Christianity is too pagan. And like those two things at the same time. And it's almost comical, in retrospect. Obviously, it's not quite as funny when like you grew up in this and then you're having to deal with all of it. But in retrospect, it's kind of funny. And the reason that it's funny to me is that they, in many ways, the humanists of the 15th and the 16th century, who really believed that they were going back to like the fountainhead of Western civilization by kind of leapfrogging over this period that they arbitrarily determined was now the Middle Ages, right? They, ironically, by doing that, they're actually more out of touch with the ancient world than they were in the Middle Ages, right? Yeah. Because in the Middle Ages, again, this is a defining quality of the medieval mind, is the ability to sort of think of yourself in continuity, that there hasn't been a fundamental rupture in human history since the resurrection.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, the resurrection is sort of the healing of every rupture in history. So the arc of history is, you could say, like the modern progressive arc is, it's supposed to always be trending up, right? But in the Middle Ages, like, Christ is already conquered, right? And the only thing that is left to you now is to, and not like it's the only thing, but the thing that is left to you now is to actually live as though that is true. And so yeah, anyway, it's just really interesting. Erasmus hates all this language of the saints, and how, oh, this saint is this, and this saint is this, and this saint is this. Hates all of that. But then also he's like, man, we should go back to ancient pagan literature because it was so great. And it's just, oh man. And I mean, it's obviously it's a kind of a contradiction. It's really a breakdown of the great medieval synthesis, and it is something which we're still dealing with the fallout of that breakdown today.
Yeah.
But the thing to understand is that, love it or hate it, this kind of language in the Middle Ages is very normal. People were just very comfortable about talking about things in these terms.